Hi, everybody. Joining me today is Dean Baker, the senior economist for the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He's also the writer of Beat the Press. We're going to break down where we're at with these banking failures. We're going to look at the truth. We're going to look at the lies. He is someone I really trust for his economic and political insight. So stay tuned. This is the Julianna Forlano Show on the Political Voices Network. Well, where do we start? Let's start. I got a little video from this weekend from Elizabeth Warren appearing on what was it with Chuck Todd.
Can we just start?
I want to hear your response to how she is framing the issue and where we're at. Is that cool?
Sure.
Great, thanks.
To believe we were out of the woods. Do you still feel that way this weekend? I saw some disturbing news about Credit Suisse, going to have to be essentially ended. We got more mid-sized banks, can't find buyers. Is the contagion contained or not?
Well, can we just start, though? Let's roll this back just a little bit about what went wrong. Remember, Gary Becker and the other CEOs of these multi-billion-dollar banks came to Washington back in 2016, said, lighten the regulations on us. Donald Trump ran for president saying, I will lighten the regulations on these big banks. He gets put in and he puts in bank regulators who lighten the regulations. He then goes to Congress and says to Congress, give them the authority to lighten the regulations even more. And Congress, with help from both parties, obliged him. Then Jerome Powell just took a flamethrower to the regulations, weakened dozens of the regulations. And then the CEOs of the banks did exactly what we expected. They loaded up on risk that boosted their short-term profits. They gave themselves huge bonuses and salaries and exploded their banks. So the problem we now face is twofold, as you described this. What are we going to do to make sure that the banks across this system are stable? That is, these big banks. The little community banks, they're doing great. But these banks that are multi-billion-dollar banks, how are we going to make sure that they are stable and that we've got a set of rules in place going forward that will keep them safe? So I want to see an independent investigation. Fed doesn't just get to investigate itself. I want to see us make a change in the laws, roll back the rollbacks to put tougher regulations in place. And we finally need to step in and say, these bank CEOs, we've got to align them so that there are clawbacks, they're giving up on these big salaries, and they don't get to go into banking again if they explode a bank. So that's how I see the overall system right now.
Okay, but
Dean Baker, what do you make of Elizabeth Warren's plan?
Well, I'd largely agree with what Senator Warren said. I mean, this, to a large extent, isn't a debatable point. The Republicans ran, or Donald Trump ran on a platform, said he was going to roll back Dodd-Frank. They did that. They passed a law in 2018, which had Democrats, there were Democrats on board that too. So Senator Warren was right in pointing out it wasn't just Republicans, but obviously they controlled House and Senate at that point. And of course, Donald Trump was a Republican. And that explicitly lessened the regulation on large banks like Silicon Valley Bank. So the whole issue there, I shouldn't say the whole issue, but the biggest issue was these large banks, but not the very largest banks with assets between 50 billion and 250 billion. It's a large bank, but it's not a JP Morgan with 2 trillion. I don't know exactly if they have 2 or 3 trillion. So these aren't the largest banks, but it explicitly rolled back the regulations on them. And that allowed them to get into a very precarious situation. Now, there's still oversight. So in fairness, the Fed still was doing oversight, but they somehow were asleep at the wheel. I mean, we're finding more information, and Senator Warren called for an investigation, which I hope there is, and it should be someone other than the Fed. You don't have someone investigate themselves. And they were aware of the problems, but for whatever reason, they didn't act more aggressively to try and force the bank to either raise more capital, reduce its deposits, some combination. In other words, reduce the risk that it was exposed to.
I noticed that today in the New York Times, before the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, the Fed spotted big problems. The bank was using an incorrect model as it assessed its own risks. So anyway, the question that was asked of Elizabeth Warren is the contagion contained? And she didn't answer that. And I'm assuming that her answer is, we can infer that the answer is no, because these restrictions aren't in place. What are your thoughts about the contagion?
Well, it is very hard to judge because a lot of this is irrational. Yeah, and when I'm saying irrational, people are fearful and sometimes with very little cause. So we can't say how fearful will people be. Are they confident? I mean, you had people withdrawing money from banks where it was 100% insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation.
Yeah.
Where are you going to put your money? Are you going to get cash and put it on,
In
if
the
you don't trust the
backyard in a
Federal
bottle, like my grandfather used to do. What?
Yeah, I mean, some people may want to do that. I don't think most people are going to do that. So it is an irrational story. And I'm going to say, I think the media has done an absolutely horrible job in trying, in essence, almost promoting panic. I'm reluctant to say that they're trying to do that, but
Well, the
the
media loves
effect of which
promoting
they're
panic.
reporting,
That's how
I'm
they
sure.
get viewers, is by promoting panic, and then you have to still turn in. Even Chuck Todd's question was all about, oh, should we panic? And Elizabeth Warren deftly uh rerouted that question to be like, let's talk reasonably about government. But yes, to your point, I agree so
Yeah,
wholeheartedly.
let me make a point on this that's gotten. I was just on a list and I was asking people, had anyone seen I read the Times, as you might imagine, New York Times very closely. And one of the really important facts that I've seen mentioned basically nowhere, and I don't think anywhere in the New York Times, that when the FDIC moved to close down the bank a week ago last Friday, literally in the statement where they announced we're shutting down the bank, they said that we're going to issue an advance payment for all deposits, all uninsured deposits next week. So this is that Friday. So is it going to be Monday? Is it going to be Tuesday? That we don't know. Next week, you'll get an advance payment, and then you'll get a certificate for your remaining funds. So just to throw some numbers out there, these are educated guesses. The advance payment might have been something like 70% of your deposit. So if you had, let's say, 10 million there, so you have 9.75 million uninsured, they'd pay 70% of that, 630,000 thereabout, 6.3 million, I'm sorry. And then they'd give you a certificate for the remaining amount. How much would that be worth? Well, they'd see, that really depends on what the assets were, how much could be covered. You're worried you have to wait? No, someone's going to come in there that day. They'll say, I'll buy that certificate from you. They're going to, presumably discount it because it's uncertain, going to be some time, but you get most of your money back right away. And that was not conveyed at all in really pretty much all the reporting I've seen, certainly in the New York Times. It was as though, oh, you lost all that money. And that literally was not true. It's just a lie.
And
So
how effective do you think? I mean, how much do you think that reporting sort of contributed to the runs on the other banks and the panic that other even smaller investors were feeling?
I think hugely. I mean, it was not, people didn't stand to lose all their money. And look, I understand it. I mean, I'm not up there having, 10 million in the bank, but I mean, I understand if someone had 10 million in the bank, they would not want a story where they could lose 10 or 15%. I think it might end up being
Well,
much less than that.
I feel the opposite. I'm like, if I have 10 million, I can afford to lose 10 or 15%, right? I mean, it's like the greed builds on greed and makes more greed.
Well, that, again, this was one of the things that was totally inaccurately conveyed. So the important point to me, so they had business accounts. So this is, so much of the money, I mean, you had some rich people that might have had 10, 20, 30 million in there. I'm sure there were some of those, but a lot of these were business accounts. So you have someone that's running a business and their payroll is 10 million a month. That's not a small business in my book, but in any case, whatever, your payroll's 10 million a month. And suddenly you get whacked and you lose $1 million. Well, that's a hit. You're not happy about it. Is it going to put you out of business? Probably not. But they totally misconveyed that all these businesses were at risk of closing because the bank went under and now they can't get their money and they can't pay their workers. That was basically impossible, but there's always businesses going out of business. So if you're at the edge, well, yeah, that could put you over. But the reality was you did not have business all across Silicon Valley that were about to shut their doors because the Silicon Valley Bank had been taken over by the FDIC. That was a lie.
Republicans say they won't cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. But can honest, hard-working middle-class Americans really believe what these politicians say? Republicans said they wouldn't overturn Roe v. Wade. Here's what Supreme Court Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett said during their Senate confirmation hearings.
Roe v. Wade. It is a precedent of the United States Supreme Court. A good judge will consider it as precedent of the United States Supreme Court.
Roe v. Wade. It's settled as a precedent of the Supreme Court.
Roe is not a super precedent, but that doesn't mean that Roe should be overruled.
Well, we saw how that turned out. They played us for fools. Tell your elected officials to keep their hands off of our Social Security and health care benefits. Fool me once. Let Majority Rule was responsible for this message. LetMajorityRule.org is a project of the Marvin Lucas Super PAC, which is responsible for and paid for this ad and is not affiliated with or authorized by any political campaign or candidate or candidates committee.
I'm Chef Shanti, and today I'm going to show you my version of mozzarella stuffed arancini.
In 2008, the banks got bailed out because they were too big to fail, or at least that's what they said. Can you briefly explain the difference between that and now? It doesn't seem like SVB was too big to fail. What, tell us the difference, then we'll get into what Biden did.
Qualitative difference in terms of these crises and people talking about them in the same breath. They're really hugely misrepresenting what's going on. So in 2008, 2009, many of the banks were literally bankrupt. So you had a story there where their assets were tied up in mortgages, mortgage-backed securities, sometimes more complex derivative instruments, also based on mortgages, where in many cases the mortgages were literally worthless because the underlying asset, the house, had lost most of its value. So we had a nationwide fall in house prices of 30%, in many areas is over 50%, some as much as 70%. Largest falls tended to be where the most mortgages were, because those were the hottest markets. So you had a lot of banks that had mortgages on a house that might have lost 60, 70% of its value. That mortgage is basically worthless because the effort to go through a foreclosure is probably going to be about as much money as what you might hope to get from selling the house. So those banks were literally bankrupt. They didn't have money. So we had a nationwide banking financial crisis that was real. Here, we're talking about modest losses. I mean, I don't have their books, but what's been public about Silicon Valley Bank was they bought long-term treasury bonds, 10-year, 30-year bonds. Those aren't worthless. But if you bought them when a 10-year treasury bond was paying 1.5% interest, and today it's like 3.5%, well, it's lost 10 or 15% of its value. Now, all their assets weren't in those 10-year treasury bonds. So some portion of their assets lost 10 or 15% of its value. Now, that could well mean it does have a shortfall. But it's not a story where they have large amounts of assets that are literally worthless. So that's a qualitatively different picture. Now, in terms of who's getting bailed out, they're bailing out the depositors. The bank did go under. So if you're a shareholder in the bank, you're out of luck. They replaced the top executives. So they're, I'm reluctant to say out on the street because I was looking at their salaries. Their CEO was getting $9.9 million. So he's out of his job, but he's still doing fine.
That's so sad. They're going to have to
in
sell their love
2008,
yacht and
2009, they kept the banks intact with the exception of Lehman, of course, Lehman Brothers, which did go bankrupt, but they kept the other banks and AIG, they all were still there.
So back to the point you made about the media drumming up this crisis into like a full-on panic in general. I feel that there's a connection. It seems to me that there's a connection between what the mainstream media is doing and what the evangelical, the end is nigh, right-wing media on the internet is doing, which is predicting banking collapse, predicting, I guess, socialists to come in and take over and give you only some sort of card. And that's the money. And it's not, there's all kinds of craziness out on the internet about banking collapse. I have a feeling that that is playing in to the mainstream media's narrative because they're certainly aligned in terms of content. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, you always see the end is near. I mean, those stories, I mean, you'll always see that on the internet. I mean, the old days, you'd have people on the street with their, sandwich signs saying the end, but now they're on the internet all over Twitter or whatever.
Why go outside when you can just stay inside?
Yeah, exactly. So is that playing into that? I can't say. I mean, you have reporters, and I pick on the New York Times because they're basically the best paper in the country, and they should understand what's going on, and they really have been misrepresenting that. And I'll just say this is, to my view, this is part of a larger picture that they've been trashing the economy pretty much since Biden took office. So, if you look at the reporting on the economy, you think, oh, this is a horrible, horrible economy. And go, wait a second, we have 3.6% unemployment. That's just about the lowest it's been in half a century. Wages are actually exceeding inflation for those at the bottom end of the income distribution. So they're doing well. We had 20 million people refinance their homes, save in many cases $2,000 or $3,000 a year. These are middle income people. I'm not talking about someone with a $2 million house. I'm talking about someone with, a $250,000 mortgage. If you refinance the 1 percentage point reduction, as many people did, you're saving $2,500 a year on your interest payments. And we have this huge explosion of work from home where people are saving thousands of dollars a year in commuting costs and hundreds of hours in commuting. A lot of good things you could say about the economy. I mean, plenty of problems, no doubt about it. But this is not a depression economy. But if you read the news coverage, you think, oh, things are horrible. They've just never been worse. And sorry, that's nonsense. So anyhow, I see this as part of that, oh my God, now we have a banking crisis. So I just think it's been this effort to really trash the economy ever since Biden took office.
Well, that goes right into so many other different kinds of conversations about how things get covered one way under a Republican administration, another way under a Democratic administration. The debt ceiling and spending is not a big deal when the Republicans want to do it. When the Democrats are in, oh, we're just spendthrifts. And God forbid we should give kids a free lunch so they don't starve to death. It's always the same old story. It's insane. The baseline here, are these mid-size bank runs and failures, are they actually a danger to the regular working class America? Or is this just, rich guys, battle of the titans with companies and whatever, that's really not going to touch your average working person?
Well, my expectation is they will not end up being a big deal for the economy. Now, you could tell a story where they will be, if you get this fear and then banks suddenly say, oh my God, we have to shore up our capital, we can't make any loans, and businesses aren't able to expand, maybe they have to contract, that could have a real impact on employment, jobs, wages. That would be a real story. That's not a done deal though. So if the contagion is controlled, and again, I don't think this is not 2008, 2009, where your banks across the country that were literally bankrupt. That's not true. Some banks have taken some losses on some of their portfolio. So you shouldn't have to see this sort of massive contraction in lending. But if you get, an overreaction, you can get that. And that would be a bad story for, people across the country, working people across the country.
Minocqua Brewing Company is excited to partner with Equality Vines to create Choice Wine. Choice Wine comes in two choices, Rosé and Sauvignon Blanc. This wine was created to support women's reproductive rights after the Supreme Court rolled back Roe v. Wade in 2022 and caused chaos all over the country. For all you viewers on the Political Voices Network, go to choice.equalityvines.com and type in the promo code PVN to get 10% off on Choice Sauvignon Blanc and Choice Rosé.
Republicans say they won't cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. But can honest, hard-working middle-class Americans really believe what these politicians say? Republicans said they wouldn't overturn Roe v. Wade. Here's what Supreme Court Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett said during their Senate confirmation hearings.
Roe v. Wade is a precedent of the United States Supreme Court. A good judge will consider it as precedent of the United States Supreme Court.
Roe v. Wade. It's settled as a precedent of the Supreme Court.
Roe is not a super precedent, but that doesn't mean that Roe should be overruled.
Well, we saw how that turned out. They played us for fools. Tell your elected officials to keep their hands off of our Social Security and healthcare benefits. Fool me once. Let Majority Rule was responsible for this message. LetMajorityRule.org is a project of the Marvin Lucas Super PAC with which is responsible for and paid for this ad and is not affiliated with or authorized by any political campaign or candidate or candidates committee.
Today in the Organic Kitchen, I'm going to show you a delicious way to make pizza in a pan.
So do you think there's any merit to complaints about President Biden's, what the measures that he took?
In retrospect, and even at the time, I mean, you could say his stimulus package to 1.9 trillion was larger than necessary. I don't think it was hugely larger. So you could say we didn't have to give everyone, what was it, the 2,000? Well, he was responsible for the $1,400 checks, $600 already going out under Trump. If you had lower income caps on that, so I mean, don't have to work out where exactly that'd be. You could have had lower
But I
caps.
mean more like about what he did for Silicon Valley Bank and in this particular case.
Oh no, I think they did what they had to do. I mean, it was important to try and contain the contagion. So I think he made the right call. I mean, again, I'm not happy to see their depositors. I'm on Twitter, I see all these people. Oh, you had to do it. I mean, I got a kick out of it because some of these are like these rich guys who say, oh, you have to do this, you have to do this. So I'd always tweet back and go, how do you feel about student loan debt forgiveness while we have you here begging for a bailout? So I mean, again, I'm not happy to see these people get 100%. And again, it wasn't against the baseline where they lost all their money. It was get a baseline where they'd lose 5%, maybe 10%. I mean, I don't have the book, so I couldn't give you an exact number, but it's very hard to see how it'd be much over 10%. And it could quite well have been way less than 5%. So,
Dean, go ahead.
I don't care about making those people whole, but to prevent the contagion, he had to do it.
Your comment just a minute ago about how maybe Biden shouldn't have given us all checks during COVID. It's hard to think that is, Trump gave tax cuts to the rich. How come it's not his fault that we have inflation now? I don't see how a few checks going out to the nation who then either spent them or squirreled them away or ordered something on Amazon. You know what I mean? How is it possible that particular point, when so much money goes toward the rich, towards under a Republican administration, the small amount that went to the American people gets blamed for, I guess, inflation?
Well, we did have, I think it's hard to argue, we had more demand than we could meet. This was the supply chain story, that we had ships backed up off our major ports. It was related to the pandemic, obviously, but we did for a period of time have more demand than we could meet, and that pushed prices higher. That's kind of what you expect to happen. So if we had somewhat less demand, that would have been somewhat less inflation. Again, I don't think that's a disastrous story. So it's not.
Yeah. I don't even know, because there was, the whole point about companies not hiring their workers and not giving that, and then it wasn't exactly demand that, of course, demand is going to be higher than you can meet if people aren't at work, and, you can't buy a car because, there was more to it, I think, than just demand, wasn't there?
Well, sure. I mean, we had a supply. I'm saying we could not bring things in because you had factories shut down, you had ports shut down. And
Right.
also, I mean, part of the demand story here, so people have money in their pockets. They're not going to go to a restaurant because of the pandemic. They're not going to go to a gym because of the pandemic. So what are they doing? They're buying cars or buying refrigerators or buying these big ticket items that suddenly were overwhelming our ability to ship those. And again, COVID was part of that. But I don't think, to my view, it's not really debatable that during that period, demand exceeded supply. I mean, again, it's not Biden's fault that supply was constrained. That was the pandemic, but that was the reality.
So interesting. Well, it's always great to have you on. Final question. What do you think about the fact that someone I once looked up to, Congressperson Barney Frank, whose name was on the regulation bill that would have stopped all of this from happening, is had gotten paid by SVB to literally roll back the very protections that his own bill was supposed to protect about. Your comments there?
Yeah, I think it was actually a Signature Bank, the one in New York that went under.
I apologize.
But yeah, I mean, it really was disappointing. I mean, Frank took advantage of his reputation, and you know, and he's really been disingenuous. I mean, I guess you're going to defend yourself, but you know, I saw an interview with him. I think it was in the New Yorker, but I'm not 100% sure. Where he's saying, "Oh, that 218 bill didn't matter at all." And that I'm sorry, that's nonsense. I mean, the 218 bill quite explicitly was saying that banks like Signature, banks like the Silicon Valley Bank, were not subject to the same sort of scrutiny that they would have been before 218. That's what it was about. So for him to say that that had no impact, that's just totally disingenuous. So yeah, I'm very disappointed. I was never a Frank worshiper, but I thought it was a good bill, and he did good work. He did good work on other issues during his long congressional career, and it's just a shame to see in his, well, I shouldn't say his last years, but his later years, that he would do something like that.
Thank you for your comments, and thank you so much for coming on the program. Dean Baker, senior economist for the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And check out Dean's blog, Beat the Press, because you always do the great thing where you tear down exactly the baloney coverage. We like to do that on this show too, and other ways. But you tear down and the coverage that is misleading around economic issues, and we appreciate you for it.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
Thanks so much, Dean. Appreciate it.
Minocqua Brewing Company is excited to partner with Equality Vines to create Choice Wine. Choice Wine comes in two choices, Rosé and Sauvignon Blanc. This wine was created to support women's reproductive rights after the Supreme Court rolled back Roe v. Wade in 2022 and caused chaos all over the country. For all you viewers on the Political Voices Network, go to choice.equalityvines.com and type in the promo code PVN to get 10% off on Choice Sauvignon Blanc and Choice Rosé.